Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McCusick. We're here for the second of our positional reviews for the 2023 season. This one for cornerback. Joining me is my co-host from One Last Thing, Slava Cooperstein. Slava, how are you doing?
Doing great, Ken. As time moves forward, we get a little bit further from the disappointing end of the season. And now we heal by analyzing, what was and what might be.
Yeah, it is cathartic a little bit to go through some of this thing. And one of the positions where I think you really kind of get a sense of how our expectations for the season grew a lot just during the year is at cornerback, where they were looking like they were in all sorts of trouble entering the season. Humphrey hurt, of course, Ronald Darby and Rock Ya-Sin holding down one spot, Brandon Stevens on the other, and we didn't have a lot to go on Brandon Stevens at the beginning of this season. He played a little bit, the previous year, but definitely a troubling start for the position this season.
Yeah, I mean, you said it. I think the cornerback room was the position group that I think everyone was most concerned about. At least, in particular on the defense. Having been a Ravens fan for a long time, we've seen what it looks like when the cornerback room is strong and when it is weak. And usually, it's a spate of injuries. That at some point in the season that leads them to be using their fifth and sixth and seventh corners. So we were, I think reasonably concerned going into the season, but Brandon Stevens significantly outperforming expectations. I think Ronald Darby doing so as well, and Rock Ya-Sin putting in a solid effort at the start of the season, along with the scheme. Really helped this group perform above all of our expectations.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. A scheme-based advantage. I think the cornerbacks had a much lower responsibility set with it's showing a too high shell a lot of the time. It did put some extra pressure on the linebackers, on the defensive line to try and contain the run, on the safeties for that matter as well. I will say up front here, we're not going to talk about Kyle Hamilton in this episode. We may tangentially, because I'm sure we'll hit on the scheme component and his splitting time at slot, but I'll include him with the safeties, and we'll have that discussion at that time. So we're talking about the other corners, and I think there was a lot of good unexpected news from this group, a lot of it from Darby, a lot of it from Stevens, but there's also some real failure in this group in terms of no young cornerback really stepping up and taking a role when with Marlon Humphrey out for large stretches of the season. 4 different times Humphrey was hurt for the Ravens. There wasn't any young quarterback who stepped up and took the job.
No, there certainly wasn't. And some of that is injury, but some of that is just not seizing the opportunity. I mean, Kaya Blue Kelly couldn't even make it out of camp, which is unusual for a fifth rounder. And in addition, Jalen Armour-Davis couldn't really stay healthy and really hasn't made much of an impact when he's been out there, although he did play some high value snaps this year, very, very limited, but hasn't left much of an impression. And certainly, I think it would be hard to say that he's, somebody we're relying on in next year. And, Pepe Williams, who everybody pegged as the next big thing at slot, I mean, seems to have been, supplanted by at least, 4 or 5 different guys who turned in really, really excellent effort at the slot position. I don't remember a year ever where we had as many different corners play and contribute quality snaps to the slot corner position.
Yeah, it's a good point. Washington, Marlette, Ardarius Washington all played some time at slot, all looked very good. Occasionally, I guess they even had Humphrey there.
Big time in the 49ers game. He played a decent amount in the slot. And we've known that for some time that, Marlon is very capable at both the slot and outside corner positions.
We want to get and talk to each of these individual players a little, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the loss of Denard Wilson and how that could have a very significant impact on this unit. The pressure is on again for the Ravens to hire another good position coach. I just did the first of these shows about on the defensive line, and Anthony Weaver, of course, lost to the Dolphins DC position. Denard Wilson lost to the Titans. Both those guys, replacing them is going to be a very difficult job.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess the only thing that I could say to that is that the Ravens have consistently identified and groomed really excellent coaching talent, in particular on the defensive side. Our first of all, the Ravens defensive coordinator position is one of the most coveted coordinator positions in the entire league. I think there are probably as many or more head coaches to come out of that position than any other defensive coordinator position in the league during the Ravens' time here. It's got to be close. I mean, Pat's probably have had a good number as well. But that doesn't just start with the coordinator, or doesn't end with the coordinator. It ends with a lot of the position coaches. And, this season the Ravens put together probably the most impressive collection of position coaches on the defensive side that they've ever had, which, couple that with the incredible results that we got. It's not a surprise that they got poached. But I have every reason to believe that the Ravens will continue to, have faith in their ability to reload at a lot of different spots. And I'm sure a lot of those, in-house, a lot of those are in-house candidates.
They do always have great succession planning ready to go. And so they may have, assistant defensive backs coach who's ready to be the DB coach. But I think what you said earlier is very important, that since the coordinator positions are so sought after, in particular the defensive coordinator position here in Baltimore, the possibility of moving into that role and looking down the line several years to when Zach Orr may be a head coach is just a very positive thing in terms of getting a high quality young defensive coach, position coach who might be very relatable to players, might have a great future in the league and whatnot. And you hope you can just continue to find those guys.
Yeah, and Zach Orr actually was talking about this, I think, today, because that's when I saw the quotes. He's already been he said he's been very involved in the interview process for a lot of these positions, and his attitude is, in the NFL, you never stay exactly the same. If you don't get better, you get worse, which is, I think, the right attitude to take. It's going to be tough to fill the shoes of all the coaching staff that was there last year, but I think the Ravens will have a good plan to address that.
Yeah, I agree completely. And, I said this on the other one, so I'm going to try and ask it as a question this time. In terms of John Harbaugh's contribution to this, how would you peg that in terms of importance of his responsibilities?
Well, I would say that it's probably the top two or three things that he does that he's responsible for. He's not a play caller. I know everybody's tired of the term CEO coach, but that is, for better or for worse, what he is. He focuses on, establishing a culture. He focuses on, and that carries through how practices go and sort of the mental toughness aspect of the game and everything like that. And coaching staff, I mean, is his purview, as we mentioned before. So I would say it's at or near the top of his responsibilities.
Yeah, I'm in the same place, and I don't think you can get upset about good young coaches leaving, as is certainly the case with McDonald, who's getting a great opportunity. And I'm sure he'll, he has a good chance to do very well with that in Seattle. But Harbaugh has built this group over and over, and this is how great coaching trees develop. The other thing I think is maybe something that people don't put as much value on. Obviously, the fact that this is Harbaugh's silo to make the hires on is very important. And Bisciotti, being an organization guy and a hiring guy, I think very much believes in that. The other component is that just Harbaugh doesn't strike me as a coach that would be intimidating or difficult to work for. He seems like the kind of boss that you'd want, that it certainly gives you, has expectations of you, but on the other hand, also allows you to basically run your unit and isn't stepping on your feet all the time over the headset to try and get you to do something different. A couple coaches that definitely do not fall into this category, Mike Ditka with the Bears, I think he'd have basically substituted his judgment at any point in time for whoever was on that headset. And in fact, I remember the one time he had the heart attack. Do you remember that?
I remember that, that very, very fleetingly in my mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he had a heart attack and the doctors basically told him you could be on the sideline, but you can't get on the microphone and be the head coach. So the first time they actually didn't want him even there, but then he said, "Oh no, I'll just be on the sideline. He'll sit on the bench. He'll just sit there and not use a headset." So for the first half, he could do that. And then the second half, he took over the headset again. And so obviously, this is a guy who's not willing to give up control. I think Mike Tomlin is the same way in terms of how he looks over the defense in Pittsburgh, regardless of who's actually running the defense. He may actually have that kind of a reaction. About the offense, Brian Billick, with coordinators that he had, basically got rid of Fossil at midseason, because it wasn't just a matter of he didn't think he was doing a good job. It's just he's not. That's not really his way of doing it. Coming from this offensive genius situation in Minnesota, where he'd been recognized that way, letting somebody else make the calls, it just wasn't all that comfortable for him, I don't think. So, I don't see Harbaugh as the kind of coach who basically is consistently needling and substituting his judgment for whoever's making the play calling. There may be times he has a talk at halftime saying, "Hey, we got to open it up." That was actually caught on video for the 2012 AFC Championship game. Yep. But I honestly don't believe that happens very often with the Ravens.
Well, he alleges that he discussed running the ball more in this game. So whether that means that Lamar decided to audible out of every single play, or Todd Monken just decided, you know what, I think I know better. I'm not really sure what that means, but I guess we'll see what it looks like next year.
Right. All right, so a coaching change. Let's talk players a little bit, because I think that's actually, let's talk some schematic elements here first. We're not going to talk about Kyle Hamilton, although he certainly played a lot of big nickel this year. Was extremely effective at it, and I think that the use of a safety at slot corner was extremely valuable, and it was also kind of a double-edged sword for the Ravens, in that they didn't always have the number of healthy safeties active they needed to fill the back end to allow Hamilton to stay up at slot.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that would have been the ideal configuration. Luckily, there was some pretty solid play from combination of Washington and Mollett mostly. Mollett by far, because Washington was injured for a good portion of the year. That allowed them to maintain the scheme that they really wanted to, because I think the idea of the scheme was sort of predicated on not leaving corners on an island. I think that the Ravens had enough of that, given recent schemes that oftentimes left corners with no help. And I think the Ravens also recognized that they had a lot of strength at the safety position, and also that sort of they can take advantage of sort of I don't know if you want to call it a market inefficiency or whatever, but they were able to spend more on safeties who are less expensive and get more impact out of them than try to get these top shelf corners, who are extremely expensive or otherwise difficult to come by.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And corner is one of the positions you pay a lot for, and you can pay it in cap or you can pay it in draft capital. But either way, you spend a lot on that position. Safety is cheaper, and the Ravens got a superstar top 5 talent drop into their lap at 14 in terms of Hamilton, and that has really worked out, obviously, and he's become the most significant player on their defense in terms of how they utilize him. Even while Roquan is the leader, I think Hamilton's usage is that much more significant. Too high shells a lot this year. Obviously reduced the responsibility, but also introduced a lot of rotational coverage that I think was very effective at reducing CB responsibilities.
For sure. I mean, I think, and I think that this was actually, predicated on this idea that the corners were not going to be quite as good as, and it was emphasizing the fact that the balance of talent was in the safety room more so than the cornerback room, I think. But then I think the Ravens realized that even though, Brandon Stevens was performing quite admirably, as was Darby, who were, covering on the outside for most of the season. I don't think that anybody ever gave them a reason to really shy away from it. I think they kind of, mixed in some, man concepts here and there. But the whole idea was to have this too high shell as sort of the basic kind of idea that they were going to roll with this scheme that they were going to roll with for most of the season.
Yep. And they truly got some outstanding pass rush results from that slot corner position, which is really a group effort. Hamilton there for 3 sacks in a half against Indianapolis, but also Ardarius Washington had a sack against Houston, and Mollett had 2 sacks. So, the position just gave them a lot of pass rush capabilities during the season.
And I think that that's going to be something that we're going to see a lot of other NFL teams copy next season. They're going to try to find different ways to get their slot corners involved, and they're going to consider. I mean, it's hard to find a Kyle Hamilton, right? But they're going to consider, I think, bigger, longer corners in the slot, which has traditionally been smaller, shiftier guys, because everybody's concerned about keeping up with these like really tiny, shifty receivers. Which I think the Ravens are saying, what, we're actually content with you trying to, get 5-yard completions to that guy 20 times if you want to get him involved. You're going to mess up at some point, or you're not going to get enough yardage. We're fine with, not having to match that guy step for step.
Yeah, the Ravens certainly, they forced other teams into playing a lot of small ball, getting the ball out quick. Had tremendously complementary interaction between what the secondary did in terms of coverage and what the pass rush did. And it was an all 11 men defense, certainly from that standpoint. There wasn't anybody with a real minimal role in those terms, whether it's extra pass rusher, zone defense underneath, the corners and safeties for sure doing their things, the safeties rotating to a different coverage than what was apparent at the start. A lot of the times it was just it was a joy to watch. I hope some of that, and I think the Ravens have a good organizational memory of things, that you don't just clean the slate and install a new defense or a new offense for that matter when things have been somewhat successful in the past. So they lost Wink, and they didn't completely throw away what Wink did. I know Wink was a pressure is the fastball guy, but they didn't throw all that away in terms of even the hiring of Chuck Smith, say, to try and improve their individual pass rushing skills.
No, and I agree. I mean, I think I'm not one to defend Wink too much, but I do think that he was playing with less talent in terms of the pass rush. Like Owe hadn't quite developed, or was injured quite a bit, and so I don't think he was really able to get home with 4 the way that McDonald was able to with the talent that he had at his disposal. So certainly understand that. And I think another example of what you're alluding to in terms of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when you get a new coordinator is Monken is still leading the NFL in rushing. Yeah. Everybody thought that it was going to become this extremely pass happy offense, which for most of the season was not the case. And the Ravens were able to successfully continue rushing, as well as use Patrick Ricard in key moments. When at the beginning of the season we were wondering whether Ricard would even have a role on this team.
Yeah, it's a great analogy there. I love it. Let's move on and talk about some individual players. Brandon Stevens, a emergence this year as one of the two big Ravens to step forward this season, and there were others too. I mean, you could pick a guy like Hamilton as taking that another big step forward. But I think Linderbaum, in terms of his improvement as a pass blocker, and Stevens in terms of his ability to stand up to a lot of targeting on the outside and hold down that right corner position for essentially the entire season. He did miss the Miami game. He was inactive for that, but he played every other game and played almost every other snap in every other game. Just missed a handful. And, he was targeted a lot during the early season, but he held up very well to that. Didn't have a lot of penalties early on. And just remarkable for me, for a guy who's bounced around a lot, to finally find his home, be left alone. And I don't think there's any way in hell the Ravens move him again.
No, certainly not. I mean, he's clearly found a home on the outside. The ability to play as many snaps as he did, stay healthy, be physical, and just hold up, in the biggest moments, is tremendous. And he actually, even when things didn't necessarily go his way, he proved he had the ability to have a short memory that you want corners to have. Anybody that gets targeted that much, I mean, is going to give up some big plays. I mean, it's a numbers game. And but Stevens came out certainly ahead of that numbers game and played extremely well. And the exciting thing is that he hasn't played that much corner prior to this season. So you could, I think, very reasonably project, given his age and given, what more experience he could have, particularly after a full year under his belt, you could project some improved play. Which to me makes him certainly a candidate for an early extension as soon as possible. Seems like a classic Ravens move, but I think that they also need to temper that with the idea that, you played in this extremely corner friendly environment. So they have to determine how much of it was him, how much of it was a scheme, and what they can project from him going forward.
Yeah, great point. And they're going to want to extend him this offseason if they can. This is actually the first time he can be extended right now. And it's going to be a tough nut to swallow given the limited cap they have, given what they may have to do with Matabike to get him, on to the tag and then off of it, hopefully before, long before the season starts, I would hope. But they're going to have to, move around some money to make this work. He is one of the players that I think I would go ahead and pull the trigger on. Both he and Linderbaum have, in my opinion, they have a season of gains to consolidate this next year. I just want them each to be approximately as good as they were this year. Even in both cases, probably a slight regression is okay. A big regression is not. But I think they've overplayed expectation by such a level that in each case I'd say I would just love for them to be able to hold on to what they have or fairly close to that. And there will be other natural gains that come with time. But Stevens doesn't have to take a big step forward. He had 6.9 yards per target allowed. What he needs to do is prove that those gains are real, as you mentioned, with regard to the system and whatnot. I think in his case, I think he was tested enough that we probably know a little bit more. And that's one of the reasons why I'm willing to go for the contract right now.
I agree. I think he's one of, probably the top three priorities as far as extensions. And I hope to see him in a Ravens uniform for a long time because, I think that, outside corner is where the real need is when it comes to the secondary right now.
So 6.9 yards per target for Stevens. He, though, did not finish the season particularly well. Maybe another reason for consolidated gains. He gave up almost 10 yards per target over his last 4 games and had 3 penalties in his last 5 games. So he only had 5 for the season. Didn't give up a bunch of touchdowns, which is nice. Again, I could not be happier with what happened on the season other than how it ended. Sure. For Stevens in particular, but he's a guy who I think the Ravens are going to be depending on for the future. If not, he'll be a player the Ravens it will hurt to lose after the 2024 season.
For sure, and it certainly behooves them to try to get this ironed out as quickly as possible, which is I think what the Ravens generally try to do anyways. But certainly before he increases his market value, I mean, a repeat of last year or anything even close to it would send his market value through the roof, I think.
Right. I would agree if he had 2 years to go on and he basically played all the snaps. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Ronald Darby, another big surprise in this defense. Ronald Darby, in some ways, he can't surprise you because he's been around the league forever. He's now, about 31 years old or so? I'll look that up really quickly. I know when Kyle Fuller was out in Denver, Ronald Darby was the guy who replaced him there. Fuller was benched twice during the season. But Darby actually has just turned 30 on January 2nd. So, honestly, maybe a little bit younger than I thought he was, but had a terrific year. Started off the season, Humphrey was hurt. He and Stevens had to start on the outside. He did split time with Rock Yassin early on. Then he pushed Yassin out of the role entirely.
Yeah, Darby was another, very pleasant surprise. I mean, I think that we're all pretty concerned when we thought, Darby and Yassin were going to figure very prominently into the early portion of the season, when Marlon was hurt. But he really outperformed his paycheck. I'll certainly say that. I mean, he was extremely sticky in his coverage. He was physical, pretty good run support, as I recall. Really just brought a full, skill set to the table, and can't complain at all about his performance.
Yeah, good downhill player. 5.9 yards per target, was the 5th best among all NFL corners with 300 plus coverage snaps. And his coverage snaps, they got cut not for good reasons, as it turned out, I'd say. I mean, Rock Yassin was taking some of his snaps, which honestly, in retrospect, it probably would have just been better if it had been Darby the entire time. And number two is that Humphrey came back, and Humphrey was good, but honestly, he wasn't any better than Darby this year. Even though he, certainly was not bad, but his 4 separate, stints of injury that he had meant Darby came back and played an awful lot of important snaps for this Ravens team.
Would you agree that I think that in the beginning of the season, I mean, we were sort of viewing the top 2 outside corners as Humphrey and Yassin. I mean, and the Ravens were too, I think, as far as how they who they paid, and yeah, I mean, I think it's nice to see a meritocracy. That's a credit to the coaching staff. They said, well, okay, we paid Yassin, but Darby's playing better, and Darby certifiably took his spot on the depth chart. I mean, I agree with you. I don't necessarily know that Humphrey outperformed Darby, but he is, he's a very experienced corner. He's an emotional leader. For my money, Humphrey's a guy that I view personally as the best Ravens corner of all time. I know a lot of people think Chris McAllister, but I just love Humphrey's versatility, his ability to basically play anywhere on the field, and just his physical game. I really just think he has that kind of it factor, and so that probably is kind of what the Ravens were looking at when they were deciding on snaps between him and Darby. But Darby filled in admirably.
Yeah, it's the AFC Championship game. Now, the stage does not get any bigger. It certainly didn't for the Ravens this year. But Darby started the game. Humphrey came in, played most of that second Chiefs drive before he had to leave, and he was done for the game at that point. So everybody wanted Humphrey back, but the truth of the matter is that Darby had really played very well and took them basically through this season with some wonderful play. I think there is a real question of whether he comes back or not, and that's part of it's going to be about what contract he might get offered. But what do you think is the likelihood that he'll be back?
I certainly don't think it's. I wouldn't even peg it as unlikely. I think it could go either way. I think it may even just be, how things turn out. How quickly there's a resolution. If there is a resolution to the Matabike, thing, it may just be a numbers game. I think they'll prioritize Stevens, who's younger, who has, who's been healthier throughout his career. And so, he may be, Darby may end up being just a numbers casualty, but I'd probably have him in like a, top 6 or 7, players to re-sign. And I think he could be had at a fairly reasonable price. I don't think, I don't know that there are teams that are going to be out there saying, I want him as my number 2 corner.
Right.
I think that he would be viewed very highly as a number 3, corner who's either rotating in or steps in, throughout the season.
And that's what I say too. Is he's really the 4th corner for most teams in the NFL after the nickel for most teams and the 2 outside guys.
Right.
But there aren't many teams that would, I don't think, want him any higher than that. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe somebody else should give him a better deal, but my guess is there's some team out there with a lot of cap to spend that says Darby 2 years $6 million, 2 years $5 million, 2 years $7 million even after the year he had here. Let's move on. Talk about Arthur Mollett a little bit. He was a 1-year deal, $200,000 guaranteed on a vet min salary. Mollett was absent during camp. Didn't play. I don't believe he played at all during the preseason, but he basically hardly saw any of them even at camp in terms of making plays. He got hurt. It was one of the big rotations they had to work through with Ardarius Washington eventually getting the role coming out of the preseason at that nickel where it had been Pepe, then Brandon Stevens, then Mollett, or maybe it was Mollett, then Brandon Stevens. I'm trying to actually remember. And then Ardarius Washington was really their 4th choice at the spot. And then, they started the season with Ardarius Washington and then Mollett came back and he played pretty well, I thought, as well as could be expected in terms of what he did give up 8.33 yards per target, which for the Ravens was kind of high this year.
Yeah. I think he still probably outperformed what might have otherwise been expected of him, but certainly when that sort of reshuffling happened, where all of a sudden, we're thinking, Ardarius Washington is going to be, ahead of him, and then he comes in and steps in. I think Mollett is actually, we kind of look at him as the, player who made it over Kyu Blue Kelly. If I recall correctly, he might have been, around that, edge of the roster. And, if that's the case, I think that the Ravens kind of saw something in him. They'd probably seen him, a number of times in Pittsburgh. He proved to be versatile and capable, not a star by any means, but a role player that you're not afraid to put out there. He didn't strike me as a particular liability or anything like that.
Yeah, good downhill player. Did enough in coverage that I think was solid and didn't kill, and also probably honestly really benefited from the scheme as well in terms of just having a lot of zone defense, a lot of help from the safeties, a lot of cover over the top that to make his situation not as bad. He did give up one long pass, and I'm trying to remember what game it was in, but positive season for Mollett. And I don't think he costs you any more this year coming off the year he had. And I think it probably makes a lot of sense for the Ravens to keep him. Where are you on that?
I agree. I don't think he'll cost a ton. Maybe similar level of guarantees. To show a little good faith. It seemed like he liked playing here. He liked turning that up against the Steelers in particular. Seems like he's got some chip on his shoulder for them, and that's always good to see. He's a good role player, and I'd be happy to have him back.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the year Marlon Humphrey had, and I just punctuated by injury on four separate occasions. So to remind people, he missed the first four games of the season, and they did not place him on IR at that time. So he returned at week 5, and that ends up being a mistake because the Ravens could have had an extra player on the roster during that time. Then he did not play between weeks 11 and 13. I think 13 was the Ravens' bye, if I recall correctly. So it really means he didn't play in it for 2 weeks in there. Then he didn't play in the divisional game versus Houston, so that's obviously is a big loss at that point. And then he came back for the AFC Championship game, but as we mentioned earlier, he left after midway through that second Chiefs drive. Didn't start, played the second drive, and then missed the last 3 plays of that drive and the rest of the game. So tough year for Humphrey on the injury front. I think he was trying to be out there. There were probably times during the year where he wanted to return, and the Ravens might have even held him back. But just a very tough injury year for him.
Well, Ken, it is very important to have Marlon Humphrey out there on that field goal block team. That's what we paid him all that money for. And at the end of the day, he could have gotten hurt on any play. Sometimes it's a cramping up, hydration sort of deal. But it really sucks to lose a player of his caliber on a play like that. But I'm sure Marlon wanted to be out there, every snap. He's the kind of guy that would play on one leg if they'd let him. And it pains me to say, but Marlon's played a lot of football, and this was a pretty injury-marred season. I mean, he keeps himself in outstanding shape. I think he's probably one of the most committed to maintaining his physique players on the Ravens. Just something I've observed throughout the years, and it wouldn't surprise me if he came back and had a completely healthy season next year. But at the same time, he has logged a ton of snaps. He's an extremely physical player, and it's possible that this is the beginning of a stage in his career where he's you're not going to be able to reasonably expect that you get that 15th, 16th, and 17th game out of him. And if that's the case, that really highlights all the more reason why they need to extend Stevens as quickly as possible.
Yeah, extend Stevens and probably also get younger at the position, which we'll get to a little later, I think. Humphrey was very good when he was out there this year. He had 381 coverage snaps. He's only targeted 40 times. That's just a little over 10%. Is not terrible, certainly for a corner. And when he was targeted, that wasn't particularly successful. 6.1 yards per target. I know everybody's going to remember the touchdown pass given up, the 41-yard touchdown pass to Pickens that lost the Steelers game. That'd be a very fair lone memory to take from this year for Marlon Humphrey. Now, if the general injury problems, much more not good and something that I think people will also recognize, but a really good player when active, still a big physical presence, still defends the boundary well. And, honestly, I think he's one of the Ravens that's really important to return healthy, but I think he's also a good probability to do so next year.
I think so. I don't think the nature of the injuries, based on what we've seen, should suggest that he's going to have anything lingering. I mean, if he looked really excellent, in physical shape against the 49ers. So I think the injury after that to the calf, I think that was just a completely different animal, and doesn't really feel to me like it's tied to anything else. And I think maybe just a little bit bad luck this season for Marlon.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Ardarius Washington, we talked about him winning the slot corner role with a big camp in preseason, had a sack of Stroud in week 1, which was certainly nice. Off to a fine start through 2 games, 5.9 yards per target before he was hurt. But then he did not come back from that injury he suffered in week 2. It was late in that game. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was. But he did not see any action again until the AFC Championship game when he played 2 snaps in relief of Mollett.
Yeah, it's a real shame for Ardarius, because I think that this really tremendously impacted the money that he's going to, see next year. And, he has to be really strategic about, how he wants to proceed. But I guess the thing that I would say is, it's a chest injury that he already, got surgery for right then and there, and the fact that he was able to. First of all, it's very encouraging the fact that he was able to come back the same season, just in terms of prognosticating into the future, and also. Chest injury doesn't really worry me in the way that a lower body injury would worry me for a corner.
Sure.
It's when you start getting the ACLs and Achilles and all that, all that stuff, plantar fasciitis, all that stuff is awful for a corner, and so I wouldn't expect that that Washington would have any lingering effects from this going into next year.
Now, you said something there that had me want to take a look here. Yeah, our Darius Washington, he's one of the odd ones in terms of his years of service, but he's only a year 2 player in 2023. So he'll be a year 3 player in 2023. So the Ravens actually still have control for 2 more years, which is nice, instead of 1. And I know he a lot of people, he did come out of a undrafted, but of a class that would expect that he would have. You think you expect he'd have 3 seasons right now, but he doesn't. So that at least breaks in the Ravens' favor. And of course, really sad that it didn't really work out for any of the young cornerbacks this year. Jalen Armour-Davis, obviously, he was okay in camp. Still could not find the ball in the air to save his life. I mean, he's a tall guy who can run with a lot of wide receivers. That's the good part about Jalen Armour-Davis. The bad thing is he just can't avoid penalties because he can't find the ball in the air. And he hasn't developed the skills yet to figure out how to track a receiver by touch, say, just keeping your right hand or playing by the hand fighting. He's just not there yet.
No, he's not. But they did. He did have some kind of surprising snaps, in game. I'm trying to remember which game it was that he played some pretty high leverage snaps, and extremely small sample size, but acquitted himself kind of nicely. So I'm wondering whether the Ravens have sort of started seeing something during practices from him a little bit. He certainly wouldn't be the first, second, or 10th Raven to kind of take into their 3rd year before things start to click. Certainly, a possibility, but he's going to have to show something. He's going to have to show some real improvement to make this team next year. It's definitely not a given for him.
I would agree. This is a big offseason for JAD to go out and get the position-specific training he needs to excel in this league. He's obviously missed out, some of it due to injuries, some of it maybe due to just lack of going and getting it. But he hasn't figured out how to track the football in the air. There's people he can go to that are gurus at cornerback play who would be able to teach him some of the techniques that would mitigate his deficiencies in that area. And he's a guy, obviously, who still doesn't have a ton of experience playing the position. It can't be an excuse anymore. He's in year 3. The Ravens only have him for 2 more years. And if he has a bad camp next year, he could be out. It's not outside the realm of possibility. Let's move on. We'll talk about Pepe Williams a little bit. Hurt for much of the season. They did eventually reinstate him with one of their 8. They used every single one of their IR DTRs this year, which is it's pretty cool that the Ravens were able to manipulate the roster, and it pretty well sucked because they still had one more they could have done. It would have been JAD returning for the Super Bowl. But the league put in restrictions, cutting the number to 8.
Yeah, to my mind, Pepe is actually in a worse position than Jalen Armour-Davis, even though he's probably shown more on the field. Not much more, but more. We just have a lot at slot corner, starting with Hamilton. I think that a number of players that were likely to, re-sign. that will probably be logging snaps ahead of Pepe, and he hasn't been healthy, which is unfortunate. This is an important training camp for him as well. If he shows something, even if he shows something, I think it may be tough sledding for him.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's at a crossroads here, and it's difficult to get there, and it's the last thing the player wants to hear on a season where they basically spend it on IR and rehabbing and trying to get well so they could play, and then they don't get. He didn't play any defensive snaps for the Ravens this year. I mean, not one, even though he was active for, I believe, a couple of games where he played special teams. So that was a little unfortunate. We got three others that we're not going to talk about individually. Seymour, Trey Swilling, and Trayvon Mullen, three guys who various issues. Mullen spent the year on NFI, so the Ravens didn't pay him effectively. Yeah. But they also re-signed him to a contract for 2024, so he will still be around. Trey Swilling been on the practice squad most of the year. He's probably one of the few developmental guys that's really on the roster, and he could compete for a role on the kind of the bottom of the CB depth chart for this next season. And then Seymour, who's been a great special teams player for the Ravens.
Yeah, honestly, I think I was surprised that we didn't see more than we did. But I think that just goes to show that, the Ravens got quality contributions and health from their guys at the top of the roster, other than Marlon being injured a good amount.
Yeah. Well, they certainly could have brought Seymour up. I don't think he had 3 activations. So they could have done more with him in terms of activating. They just always seemed to need another position. So they were dealing with that. Well, let's look ahead to 2024. Obviously, one of my big things for this group is they didn't get old by getting old any more than a team normally does. Everybody ages a year. Hey, that's the rules, right? But they got old because they had a tilt in their play where the older players like Mollett and Darby played well, and the younger players like J.A.D., Pepe, and Trayvon Mullen disappointed and had developmental setbacks. And I guess the one trend breaker in there is Stevens, who still is a year 3 player and not, what I would, going into year 3. And just coming out of year 3 now. He's going into year 4, who is not what I consider to be a young player anymore. Young players, you still have some of the initial hourglass of sand to look forward to, and it's already draining out for him.
Yep. They need to. It seems like DaCosta tries to take a swing at a mid-round corner almost every year. Worked out in the case of Stevens, has not worked out in the case of J.D., Pepe. Certainly, Kaya Blue Kelly was a big miss this past year. I hope that they go back to and remember one of the most successful late round corner picks of all time, which was Ladarius Webb coming out of Nicholls State, and he really, I think he showed a really technically sound game. He just came out of a very small school. Excuse me, and I really think that sometimes they look at these corners at some of these bigger schools who didn't really show that much on tape, and so I hope DaCosta and the scout team does a little self scouting on what some of the recent failures have been.
That's a really good point, because DaCosta kind of made his name with his small school scouting operation and the willingness to go out and get a Zach Sealer and other people long before that. Webb is an excellent example. A 3rd round pick. I mean, the Ravens went high for him. Brandon Williams, 3rd round pick. Ravens. I mean, these are high mid-round selections, kind of like Stevens, that they really have to work out at a significant rate for that to be a reasonable strategy. But DaCosta had done a wonderful job of scouting from the small schools. It seems like since Ozzy's retired, he's regressed to many more Power 5 picks, which has been a little bit surprising to me. I would have thought, more of his small school moxie would have shown up, and he just said, look, I've proven for years I know better than these other people by putting Ozzie in a position to be the trigger puller on a lot of these small school guys. I can do it myself, but that really hasn't been the case. I'd love to see them get back to that and take some big swings from small schools.
Yeah, it doesn't really take. I can draft a corner from Bama. That's not. But where where you can really make your bones in the later rounds is by showing that you trust your scouts and sort of what they're seeing out there and seeing if you can coach some of these guys up to take it to the next level.
Draft priority for cornerback, I'd put it pretty high on my list. I know people are saying edge and corner and wide receiver. They always say those positions, by the way. They always say those positions. Offensive tackle is very clearly number one to me, and a guy specifically who played left tackle is number one. But cornerback might be right after that. Yeah,
I don't think I would have a problem with somebody saying corner is number two priority. I mean, I completely agree with you. I think offensive tackle is far in a way. I mean, I think it's cavernous between offensive tackle and whatever the number two priority is. Just in terms of forward thinking into the future, and just looking to where the age of the roster and possible injury concerns might be. Season can get derailed so quickly with bad corner play.
Yep.
And it's really expensive, really difficult to find a midseason replacement that's of any quality. And it's really important to have a lot of depth. So I don't think corner is necessarily like so much of a problem for the Ravens right now. I think more so it's just such a needy, hungry position that requires restocking every year. You can't miss on restocking it, because if you do, you do so at your own peril.
Yeah, no, completely agree. DaCosta often compares them to pitchers as a position where you need a lot of extra depth there. That and the need to find that next great DB coach seems to be the big question for the 2024 Ravens at corner. Obviously, they're going to deal with health issues. They're going to have to try and get a healthy Humphrey for as long as they can get a healthy Humphrey for next year, and they're going to have to hope that Brandon Stevens can turn in a similar year. But they also are going to just have to do some of it by not hope and just by accumulating good depth. As well as good coaching. All right, Slava.
Agreed. Just saying, I agree, and I'm looking forward to see how they, with the likely departure of possibly likely departure of Geno Stone, how they're going to, whether they're going to maintain this too high shell philosophy, and how that'll impact how much they prioritize corner.
All right, Slava, always a pleasure to talk football with you. Really enjoyed doing the One Last Thing show with you. If you never listened to a One Last Thing, a lot of very interesting stuff from the game, some of it kind of funny, some of it other stuff, just interesting things that irked us or were interesting in some way or another in terms of being a trend for the Ravens. That's what that show was about. And I thought it was a lot of fun to do with Slava, and I hope we can continue it next year. Slava, tell folks where they can talk football with you online.
I'm on Twitter at Slava Kuperstein. That's SLAVAKUPERSTEIN.
Other folks out there, if you'd like to be on a film study short, hit me up. DMs are always open on Twitter. I want to hear from you. We'll be doing another historical series this offseason. I think we're going to be focusing on individual players who've kind of been lost in the collective memory of Ravens fans, but stand out to individuals and why that player was important to you. So if you'd like to do such a show, DM me on Twitter, and I'll talk it over with you and see if there's a good show to be had there, and we'll make a list pretty quickly. I know some popular players show up. We don't have to do the greatest players of all time. We don't have to do Terrell Suggs or Ray Lewis in this group. Everybody knows who those guys were. I'm really looking for the guys who are one level down, who were important role players for the team, who did key things in key seasons and even in not key seasons. But I want to hear from you on that. Slavo, really appreciate you coming on again for this show.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
And we'll talk to you next time on Film Study.